Hello, I'm Michael Casagnera. I'm a lead researcher at I3h and researcher at ECARES, professor at Solvay at ULB. And today it's my great honor to introduce Philippe VERWIMP for the seminar. Philippe graduated as a sociologist and economist, then obtained his PhD in economics from the KU Leuven. In his dissertation, he produced a novel analytical framework to understand the genocide in Rwanda, combining development economics, political economy, agrarian studies, political science, anthropology, and demography. He then became a fellow of the Belgian American Educational Foundation and a Fulbright Hays Fellow at Yale University, both positions at Yale. More recently, the World Bank called on his expertise to write its 2019 flagship report on accelerating poverty reduction in Africa. And he's also a founding member and co-director of the Household in Conflict Research Network. So if I have to keep going, tracking his many merits and honors, I would be spending the whole time allotted to the seminar. So let me just add that he's now a professor at Solvay, a researcher at ECARES and at I3h. And we are both very happy and very proud to have him as a colleague. Today, he will tell us about early childhood exposure to civil war and teenage cognitive development. Philippe, you have a bit less than an hour, and then we'll open the floor to general discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Michael, for this kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to attend the I3h seminars, and I also feel it an honor also to be part of the presentation team today and present my new work on early childhood exposure to civil war and teenage cognitive development. Let me first refer to the Yale experience that I had at the end of the 90s. As you said, I studied there for a year, and I studied with political scientist Bruce Russett. And in one of his classes, he taught about the consequences of war. And he at that point, he wrote a paper on that where he said that war does not end when the fighting has stopped. And now this may be a very simple insight when you look at it, but what he actually meant is that many people, especially in the media, believe that when there is an armistice or when there is a peace agreement, then we face the end of war and we could go back to normality. And in fact, Bruce Russett was teaching his class at Yale that this was elusive. This was not the case because war brings back profound changes in population composition, in infrastructure, in the distribution of poverty and wealth, and also in the institutional framework. And so the idea that after a peace agreement, one can go back to normality is really elusive. And there are lots of consequences from war in the long term. And this is even the case, and this is maybe a bit surprising for macroeconomists, is even the case when a country relatively quickly returns to a path of economic growth and economic development and has favorable macroeconomic conditions after a few years. Yeah, so what we see, and I will also refer to some literature, that after 10 years, many countries who have experienced war, they go back to economic growth and favorable macroeconomic conditions. But that doesn't mean at all that the consequences of war at the micro level, at the household level, at the individual level are over. And to illustrate that, I'm going to take an example of 3 persons who are affected by war at different ages. Let me take an example of a war that takes 3 to 4 years. And I'm going to look at a 13-year-old engineer at the end of war, an 18-year-old high school student, and a 5-year-old boy. Now, the engineer is 30 years old. He has finished his education before the war. So at age 22, 24, he finished. Then came the war. But he's 30 years old. He can now, fully equipped, use his skills to contribute to the construction of the civil war. He can engage himself again as a professional engineer, of course, under the condition that he hadn't been wounded or suffered elsewhere from war. But he has had his education. At least he can start rebuilding the country with his skills. The high school student at age 18 at the end of the war, she has missed several years of high school, and most likely she will not be able to finish her high school in a few years. The school buildings may be destroyed. Maybe her parents are dead, that you cannot afford any more education. She may end up without a high school degree. Maybe in a few years she will marry and has her first child, even and doing a professional career without high school degree. And then the 5-year-old boy, this will be the focus of my talk today. He is affected by the Civil War during what we call the crucial ages of his life, namely the age between 0 and 5, when the brain is in full development, when the body needs a lot of nutrition to grow. And when you lack that at that age, you will have permanent consequences. You will be stunted through your life, and your brain will not develop adequately. And so from these 3 examples, who have all been affected by the war that took 3 to 4 years, the age at which they are affected by that same war has very different consequences on these 3 individuals. And so the timing of exposure to a civil war in one's life is very, very important. And today I will focus on these young children because that's when you're affected in that age, you risk that the consequences will be even permanent. And for the civil engineer, the consequences of that war are probably not permanent. And for the child, they will be permanent. So what are my objectives with this paper? I want to contribute to the understanding of some of the long-term effects of civil war shocks by using micro level data. Yeah, I'm an empirical economist. I want to do empirical research. And I'm going to focus on young children who are affected by the war at the age that they were a young child, so between the age 0 and 5. And I'm going to take the country of Burundi, where I've done a lot of field work in the past. And then also I'm going to track these children 10 years later. Namely, I'm going to have results of their cognitive development proxied by their school test scores. And I'm going to use that to find out if there is a war impact on their cognitive development and investigate the channels. How can we investigate the channel by which war may have an impact on cognitive development? And I'm also going to draw some policy conclusions. And when I have the time, I will also make the link to the COVID-19 crisis that we are facing today. So some of the literature, by means it's not complete, of course. I have only 1 slide on the literature, but let me cite some of the main works on the consequences of war. We had in 2017 the book by Walter Scheidel, The Great Leveler, where he said that war levels incomes, and especially war is devastating for the richer part of the population because they're losing all their wealth. And so that's why the title of the book says it itself. War has a lot of consequences. It levels, namely, incomes throughout society, and especially the wealthy are losing their wealth. There are a number of papers in the literature: Davis and Weinstein in Japan, Brackman, Gerritsen and Schramm for Germany, Miguel and Roland on Vietnam, Bellows and Miguel on Sierra Leone, where they investigate the relatively fast recovery at a macroeconomic level of economies that are hit by civil war and by war. At 10 years' time, basically, we have seen rapid economic growth, recovery of GDP per capita in these countries. Nevertheless, as I pointed out in the beginning, that doesn't mean at all that all individuals and households have recovered from these war shocks. And I have some previous work on that, on Rwanda and Burundi, especially dealing with health consequences, where I'm building on that kind of work today. Just to point out that there is a kind of divergence between the macro literature here and the micro literature, whereby the macro literature is relatively at ease, I would say, with those consequences of war because they see a relatively rapid recovery, whereas the micro literature is much more cautious, much more critical about this recovery analysis because they find these devastating long-term effects of war. Now,
if I can add something, if you look at the research by Thomas Piketty,
yes,
you see that the wars indeed reduce inequality a lot in our countries, and it took 30 years basically to resume. But his point is that the reduction in inequality happened through the 2 world wars.
Well, in fact, he is a bit critical of Scheidel, where Scheidel says Nothing reduces inequality except war, whereas Piketty says, no, we can reduce inequality by social policies. So Piketty is a bit more positive on the potential to reduce inequality. For Piketty, war is one way to reduce inequality, or social policy is another. Yeah, and so Scheidel does not agree with Piketty on that. So that's the difference between the two. But I think the Scheidel is more about war, whereas Piketty's work is more about the role of social policy in reducing inequality. I'm here especially about, let's say, the GDP per capita. I'm not talking a lot about inequality, but you have a valid point that made by Piketty. Yeah. Now, there is a lot of work on school test scores, and my point is to combine these two strands of the literature. The work on test scores is mostly on developed countries. We have a lot of data in the PISA studies. The PISA studies are mostly done in OECD countries. And if there is work on development, it's focusing on enrollment, it's focusing on dropout, it's focusing on completion rates. And mostly this is the case because we do not have school test score data from many of these countries, especially not from many students, especially not on the long term, which is definitely a feature of the PISA studies in developed countries. So on those studies that we have in developing countries, when these studies are done and they're focusing on the quality of education, they find a very poor level of education. So many of you know that since 10, 15 years, thanks to the Millennium Development Goals, the enrollment issues, the enrollment problems in schools in developing countries have been more or less resolved. We now have 80, 90% of the students are enrolled nowadays. So that is not anymore there, the problem. The problem is now, what are they actually learning in school? Yeah. And these studies found out that even when you have many students enrolled and a large percentage of the students going to school, they don't learn much. When we do reading and math scores in, for example, 4th grade in primary school, many of these studies found that students cannot read a simple sentence. And so the focus in the research the last couple of years is not anymore on enrollment and on the completion of grades, but actually on the learning behavior. What are students actually learning? You have Dickerson et al. On the gender gap in math, Bohn et al. On reading. We have Duflo and colleagues, Duflo and Kramer on the absence of teachers in schools, which are a large body of their work on India. We have Lance Pritchard's book on school systems. We are all very important contributions on the lack of quality, in the schooling, and especially on the drivers of that. Teacher absenteeism is one of them. Overcrowded classrooms are also there. The lack of learning material, of course, the poor environment in general, but also a lack of nutrition. When we do research in schools in Africa, we find a lot of students sleeping in the classrooms. And that's because they have not been had adequate breakfast in the morning, and they sleep during school. What helps them, for example, is to offer meals at school. So we have a lot of work going on. Mostly this is on enrollment and completion rates, not so much on test scores. The paper that's most related to my paper is a recent paper by Brook et al. In the Journal of the European Economic Association, where they found that Palestinian high school students who have been exposed to bombing raids recently, or in the months, not recently, but in the months before their final high school exam, were doing worse at the exams compared to students who are not exposed to violent raids. And so the point of that paper is that the violence occurred just prior to the exams. Now, what I will do is I will refer to violence that took place 10 years earlier. Yeah, and this kind of work, to the best of my knowledge, has not been done much. So a few words on the situation in Burundi. You have a war started in 1993 because the recently elected president Ndadaye was assassinated. He was killed by the Tutsi-dominated army because the army felt that its privileges by the new government were undermined. Namely, the president had pledged to attack inequality and injustice in the country. And that was the point of start for a war between the government army and rebel movements that spreads over the entire country, but gradually. It started from the north and it gradually spreads from the northwest over all the provinces. It was a low-tech war. What I mean by that is it was not by gunship helicopters or warplanes, but with a relatively simple means. The army fighting the rebels, they would then flee, they would return at night, they would attack some army posts, they would capture some civilians, they would rob the cattle and animals for their feeding. They would then go 10, 20 kilometers further and they would attack again. Then the army would hunt them again. And so in fact, it was the civilians that took the brunt of the violence, because the army wanted to prevent civilians that they would cooperate with the rebels, and the rebels would steal belongings of the population and also kill the population. Over the 12 years of the war, an estimated 300,000 people have been killed. And there was a power deal, a peace deal with power sharing. But as I maintain, as I say, this is definitely not the end of the war, because a lot of people have suffered at the micro level. If I paint this on a timeline, then we have the following picture: war starting in 1993, ending in 2005. In the year 2000, and I will come back to the data collection, we have a mixed data collection. This is a multiple indicator cluster survey by UNICEF, who collected data, especially detailed anthropometric data on children between 0 and 5 years old. So these children are born in 95, 96, 78 until 2000. So we have very detailed information on those children. And that's especially when the war was ongoing in Burundi. So the mixed survey managed to collect data on children, especially born during the war. Yeah? And then 10 years later, 2010, 2011, 2012, we have results of nationwide school test scores that students have to sit to be admitted to secondary school. So the test is at the end of primary school. So this is the time setup that I will use. So we have data on very young children, especially health data, and we have nationwide test scores of all students in Burundi 10, 15 years later. A little bit of information on the education system in Burundi. So you are informed about the data that I will use. So what students in Burundi do is they enter primary school around age 8, 9 on average. It's a bit later than in the West. They also finish later than. They finish on average at age 15, but by means not all students finish the primary school. There's a lot of dropout. Yeah. The test that they have to take to be admitted to secondary school consists of French, mathematics, Kirundi, the national language, and also environmental science, which is a combination of geography and biology. And the maximum you can obtain in total on the test is 200 points. And then each year the ministry has a number of reserved seats in the secondary school system. So they set the threshold, a minimum threshold that the students should have in order to be admitted to the secondary school, depending on the number of seats available. In the lycée, they had about, at that time, so I'm talking about 2010, 11, 12, about 3,300 available seats in the lycées. So the top students would get these seats. And then they had a second tier system in the Collège Communal for about 30,000 more students. This is a very selective system because every year about 200,000 students take the test. And so you only have a very limited number of students who are allowed to go to the secondary school, which was of course very difficult for students who were not allowed to secondary school because they saw themselves unable to continue their education. A few words about the data sets that I'm using. So this is the multiple indicator cluster survey with anthropometric data on more than 3,000 children collected in 2000. We also have the administrative record of the Ministry of Education with the test scores of the Concours National. So this is this nationwide exam in 2010, 11, and 12, which has the names of the students, the province and municipality of residence, the year of birth, the gender, the name of the school, and the test results of the students. And then I'm going to use also a self-constructed data set on the start, duration, and end of hostilities in each of the provinces of Burundi. This is based on the historical record. When were there attacks? When was there violence between the rebel army and the government army, which was not at the same moment in all the provinces? And you will see that I'm using the variation over time and space for my identification strategy. That will be important. Not everybody is exposed at the same time. It depends on their area of residence and their cohort, their birth cohort. That's what I will use as a variation. And it is the combination of these three data sets that I think is unique in this study to inform us about the long-term impact of the conflict. Very importantly, I'm going to have to match these data sets because, as you can understand, in data sets of developing countries, a lot of mistakes occur. Names are misspelled, ages are, for example, they can be wrong with 1 or 2 years, the sex can be wrong, the year of birth may differ in data sets, and so what I will have to do, I will have to use a matching algorithm to match these two data sets. And for that, I'm going to use the reclink command in Stata, which gives you a probability score for two cases to be the same in both data sets based on the variables that you have given for the identification. And for me, this will be the name, the year of birth, the province of residence, and also the gender of the child. I'm going to use these identifying variables to match cases into data sets, namely first the mixed household data sets and the registry of the Ministry of Education. And I'm only going to retain those cases with a very high matching score. So 95% for that, and that yields 941 pupils from the household data, or then matched with the school registry data. And from that 94 students, I have 714 with a unique match. So that's a match of 100%, meaning all identifying variables are the same in both data sets. And then I also have 227 cases where one child is matched with 4 or 5 potential matches in the other data sets because there is a spelling mistake or there is 1 year different. For example, the birth year is not 96 but 95. Yeah. And for those where multiple matches are possible, I will use bootstrap estimation, where the data are resampled with replacement within each case of a multiple match. That's a technique to resample the data with potential matches. I am, of course, very much aware that there are selection effects in the data. Namely, there are many students who even do not get to the level of the exam, and they drop out in 3rd grade or they drop out in 4th grade. In my previous work, I've also shown that children are with bad health in early infancy are more likely to die in the subsequent years. And so those children will never even arrive at the time where they can do the nationwide exam. In this presentation, I'm not going to investigate those selection effects. I know they are there. I'm just going to focus on the health effects on the test scores. What are the main variables that I'm going to use? First of all, those test scores, of course, they are from 0 to a maximum of 200. I'm also going to use the test scores at face value, but I'm going to also make a ranking of the test scores, and I'm going to use the standard deviation of the test scores to standardize the different exams, and that does not affect my results. I will use as a health variable mainly the height for age set score. For those who are not familiar with this indicator, the height for age set score is a long-term indicator of health. It's your height for age set score is something you cannot change in the short run. And that's why they say the weight for age is something you can change in the short run by eating a lot of food. Your height is something that is chronic. It is a long-term indicator of your health, and it's computed by referring the height of the child to the median height of a global reference population divided by the standard deviation. So it's a Z-score, it's a standard deviation to which degree the child that you're having in front of you differs or in its height, in the median height compared to a standard population, and that is expressed in standard deviations. When the standard deviation is strong, and that's in the literature is set at -3, then we say that this child is severely undernourished or severely stunted. When it's a little bit less, between -2 and -3, we say the child is moderately undernourished. And this is for researchers who use anthropometric evidence to say something about the health, the long-term health, because it's an accumulation of health deficits. So that's typically measuring height. It measures the accumulation of deficits over the ages. For anthropometric researchers, this is a very important indicator and a widely shared indicator of one's health. Then for my war exposure variable, I'm going to see at what time there is battles going on between the rebel army and the government army in the province where the child resides between 0 and 5 years old. And that's what I'm going to do. Just for Mikael, maybe I see a few questions in the chat, maybe, or is that, are you looking at that, or just?
Yes. So there is one question by Anne and Nguyen, which I guess is more for general discussion, if I understand correctly.
Yeah.
And we have Georges Casimir who may want to intervene now.
Yes, but I can wait until the end of the presentation.
Okay, very good.
All right, so these are the variables I'm looking at. I'm having a proxy for cognitive development, which is the test scores. I'm having a health indicator at early young age, and I'm also having these war exposure indicators. Now, some descriptive results will show the difficulties I have for this kind of analysis. Namely, you remember that the health data are collected in the year 2000. Now we know from data on anthropometrics that older children, let's say who have age 4 or 5, they already have a worse health score, because it's an accumulated deficit. So if you measure the health in 2000 of somebody who is born in 1999, so who is 1 year old, you will not find a lot of deviations from the median. But if you measure a child that is 4 or 5, he or she already shows deviations. And you see that here on the graph. So on the vertical axis, you see the height for age Z-score. And the black line tells you how it evolves compared to the birth year of each student. So older students already have a worse height for age, even when they are not affected by civil war. And this is a general finding from the literature that older children have worse height for age Z-scores. Now you also see that these older children have worse exam scores. And so one reason for that is that they may take the exam at later age. So they already have, let's say, some years of maybe redoubling the years, or maybe stopping education and then restarting later on. But also the exam at the end in 2012 for the younger students was easier. So that also troubles the finding and makes it more difficult. That I have to take into account mainly 3 things. So the age at which the height for age Z-score is measured, the age at which the exam is taken, but also you see that the students born in 95, 96, 97 bear the brunt of the violence. And you see that on the right-hand slide, those students who are born in 99, 98, they also succumb some violence, but less than the older generation. And so the older generation will have more of the violence. So three variables come into play that make the analysis challenging: is the age at which you're exposed to violence, the age at which you take the exam, and also the exam year itself, namely the difficulty of the exam is not the same every year. And so I will try to tackle these difficulties in an econometric framework. And well, before I do that,
a technical question for your graphs there. You stop in 1999, the birth years, and it stops with stunting at -2.1 z-score, which is still severely stunted.
Yes.
So if you go further down to, I don't know, 2005, you still have 10 years of data later, I guess?
No. So the data collection was done in 2000. Yeah. So
that's
I have no other data collection, and of course these height for age z-score, they also averages. So you will find students.
No, I understand that, but it was I was wondering if it shouldn't converge to 0.
No.
So basically, what is your benchmark population? And
yeah, so the benchmark is that global reference population that is not undernourished. Yeah. So
in Burundi.
Yeah, no, not in Burundi. That's worldwide. So
so if you have height differences, I don't know anything about Burundi, but if the average height in Burundi is lower than I don't know, in Holland, and you're comparing to the Dutch.
Yes, but you're not comparing to the Dutch. You're compared to a global reference population, which is a weighted average of dozens or maybe even hundreds of groups in the world. So you will have Japanese, Chinese, Dutch, Americans included in that global reference population. So it's not.
So we should not expect this to converge to 0. It should converge to some constant. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is the basic setup. We have 3 years of exams whereby almost 200,000 students participate in the exam. You see the average score of the exam is for the first 2 years is very low. The exam was very difficult. The 2012, the exam is much more easy. Yeah, so I'll have to account for that. You will also see the minimum thresholds that at that year the students will have to reach to be allowed either to the lycée or to the collège communal. In today's paper, I'm not going to use these thresholds. I've used them in other work, but I'm not going to use these thresholds right now. I'm just going to use the full test results because I'm not actually interested in which lycée or which collège communal they were allowed to. I'm just going to look at their test scores. So the methods I'm going to use is actually, I'm going to use 3 equations basically. First is I'm going to use different cohorts, birth cohorts exposed to the war at different time, depending on their province and residence and their birth cohort. I'm going to use that variation over time for that identification. I first start with the estimation of the effects of one's health under nutrition, represented by this height for age z-score on school test scores. Later on, I will call that a naive estimation because there may be underlying factors not captured by the health or nutrition proxy that I'm using that may affect both undernutrition and the test score. Yeah, so I'm calling that naive. Then I will estimate the effect of exposure to civil war on early childhood z-score. So I want to see if exposure at the time of the war affects the z-score of that young child so that I can use that as an instrumental variable. Now, I'm not just going to use an instrumental variable strategy, but I'll use a CPM estimate, which is, I think, more advanced than an IV method. A conditional mixed process estimation fits a large family of multi-equation, multi-level estimators, which includes instrumental variable regressions, which have a recursive structure. So the CPM method allows you to both fully, let's say, specify your two equations. First of all, the determinants of the health factor. So you're going to fully explain the determinants of the height for age z-score, of course, by exposure to civil war variables, but also by other variables. And then you're going to use that to estimate the second equation. Yeah, so the effect on the test scores, where you fully have your estimate of the height for age z-scores based on the first equation, which is actually an instrumental variable strategy, but it's a stronger version of that. Okay, so the first estimation is this one with the test.
Sorry, just to make sure we are not losing anybody, could you explain this a second time, but not technically?
Yes, so you not technically, let's say in other words, you basically first want to estimate the determinants of health. Yeah, because that appears first, namely as a young child between age 0 and 5. And when you have that estimate, you're going to also bring that into the second equation, where you're going to estimate the effect on the test scores 10 years later. Yeah, and you cannot do that.
We're talking about the effects of health, past health on test scores today, not the effect of war on test scores, right?
Exactly, because you see that health. So the war happened 10 years ago. Yeah, so you want to see if at that moment, at the crucial age of the child, that had an impact on that health. And the child will carry those health effects 10 years later. That's the idea. Yeah, and this is called an instrumental variables strategy. But you can also put that into a more advanced CPM estimate, which gives you a lot more details and allows you to model that first what we call the first stage, that model that more detailedly. Yeah, you will see it here when I present it. So here you first want to estimate the test scores, see if there's an effect of your health variable, and you bring in that at the age of exam and the year of birth fixed effects, and also the year of exam fixed effects. And you see when you bring all these variables in, the height for age z-score determines statistically significantly the test score, except for the year of birth fixed exam. When you bring in the age exam as well, you will see that it's not statistically significant anymore, but this is what I call a naive estimation. The younger children have already a better height for age z-score. They then participated also in an easier exam. And so for me, it's not a surprise that in this first estimation, the last column, you have no effect on height for age z-score. Yeah? But you see in the columns 941 students, when I take all the ones who have exactly one match, and then I also take the highest matching score for the 227, and then for columns 3 and 4 I do the bootstrapping estimate to account for the ones we have multiple matches. Yeah, the graph sees a kind of tendency where I'm looking at. So the ones with better height for age z-scores also have better school results 10 years later, and that's the idea of linking those two. So the horizontal axis is in the midst of war, at the height for age z-score, and the vertical axis is the test score 10 years later. Let me then go to the second equation, where I want to estimate the determinants of the health. So the determinants of the health are, of course, exposure to the war, which can be measured in different ways. It can be, what I mainly use is a dummy variable. So is the child living in a province that at that time was the theater of fighting between the rebel movement and the army? Yeah, that's the dummy variable. In the second column, I do that for different ages. Yeah? So was it exposed between birth and the first year of life, exposed between the first year of life and the second? These are all dummy variables. Yeah. I also use a continuous variable exposed in the percentage of months. So for example, if the child is 3 years old, so it has 36 months of life, then this variable measures how many months expressed in percentage terms the child was exposed to the civil war. Of course, if you combine that in the same regression with a age at service, so you have to include it, because even in the absence of war, people of different ages will have different height for age z-scores. You will see that it is a linear variable from 0 to 59. The exposure variable is not significant anymore in this regression. If you do the year of birth fixed effects, it turns out to be significant again, but the dummy variables always appear statistically significant. Yeah. So that is my second regression, is the exposure variable that explains the height for z-score at the time when the child was very young. Yeah. The graph also gives you an indication. So the left-hand graph, where the 0 is on the bottom of the page, is the height for HZ score of non-exposed students. Yeah, so those children were not exposed to civil war. They have on average -2. That's so moderately undernourished. Then the ones who are exposed to civil war have -2.5, which means severely undernourished. Yeah. I will have to, at some point, also compare those students to see if they have the same profile or background characteristics. I have not put that into a graph yet, but it's on my to-do list.
Can you separate the effect of age from the effect of the intensity of the war across years?
Yes, so you control for the effect of age. That's what I basically do here. So I control but for the age effect, namely by the age at survey, so how old, or by the year of birth fixed effects. Those are the two variables that control for the birth year. Yeah, either in a linear way, so age in months, or with the year of birth fixed effects.
But don't you? So you just want to be sure I understand that. I know it's always 10 years after, right?
Yeah. The exposure is at the same time. The test scores are 10 years later. The school test scores are 10 years later.
But so if I have, say, no war in 95, war in 96, no war in 97, don't I have a perfect correlation between age and the occurrence of war?
Not really. So you either in the 0 to 5 variable, I want to see if the child was exposed, yes or no, between age 0 or 5, depending on the province where it resides.
Okay, yeah? So you use the geographic. Okay, thanks.
I use it geographically and over time. That's the combination of the two. Yeah. Okay. So here I combine that now in a CPM framework. Yeah. So I estimate first the determinants of health, and then I bring that determinant of health into the second equation. That's why you see a hat on the height for HZ score, because it's instrumented in the language of instrumental variables. But make sure that it's a complete regression, which we don't do when we use the IV framework. We don't do that normally, but with CPM, as I show, first equation there in the table, you first estimate that in a full regression, and then you bring that into the second one. So I control also now for the gender of the student, for the level of education for the mother. I combine also the year of the exam fixed effects because it captures all the elements that are different for each exam, namely the level of difficulty of the exam. And I use province fixed effects. As you can see, the height for HZ score when the child was young now has a positive effect on the test score. Namely, the better you are, so the more healthy you are as a child as young age, the better will be your test score 10 years later. Yeah, and the effect, the magnitude of the effect differs a bit from the different specifications, but it's about 10. So that measures in standard deviation. So one standard deviation increase in the height for HZ score will increase the test score with 3, 8, or 10 units, which is about 3 to 5%. Yeah, because the test score, the maximum test score is 200. Yeah, so that's kind of the magnitude you're looking at. So you have a 3 to 5% increase in the test score, which for each standard deviation increase in the height for HZ score. Now, a standard deviation increase in the height for HZ score is substantial. Yeah, it brings you from severely undernourished to moderately undernourished. So that's quite an improvement. On the other way around, you can also look at a decrease. A decrease in the height for HZ score with one standard deviation results in a decrease of the test score 10 years later.
Philip, can I ask a question, please?
Please.
So it seems in principle, the family background can also have a lot of impact on, how all these children, what were the impacts on all these children. So I was wondering two things. So in this table, you show that you're controlling for whether the mother is educated. So my questions are, how is this variable calculated? Which level of mother education are you considering?
Yeah.
And also if you have more information about family background in general about like, you know, previous wealth, income levels or the like.
Yeah.
Also because that could eventually lead to heterogeneous effects among these children. So I was wondering if some more information about the family background.
Yeah, those are good points. So in the mother educated is here whether or not she finished primary schooling. Yeah, so it's a dummy variable. Yeah, I have not looked at other family background variables, but I think in most of those household data set there is a wealth variable somewhere. There is maybe a stock variable on the number of animals they have, or an asset variable. Yeah, so those are good points that I can look at if I can do something more on family background. But for the time being, I'll only look at mother education. From my previous work, I know this is quite correlated with household wealth. Yeah, so education is relatively also a good indicator of wealth. But it's a good point. I will investigate that further.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I heard some background noise. Yes.
Yeah. So I was wondering about the exogeneity assumption of your instrument, because so exposure to war is also correlated to like family disruption, or like the fact that parents won't be there anymore to help the kids to get into education correctly. So I wonder whether like your instrument is not also partly correlated with other factors apart from the health of the children that also affect education.
Yes. So that's a good question. So I look at I heard some noise somewhere. I don't know if somebody is not muted anymore, but I looked at the test statistics to see if my variables are valid and if the model is identified. That seems to be the case. So that's one thing. Now, normally, for example, mother's education would be accomplished before the war starts. Right, so if a mother is educated, means she has accomplished her education before the war starts, because then she gets the child. So her education will not be affected by the war. Yeah?
No, I'm thinking more about the presence of her.
Yeah, I could maybe, and that's also what Sophia's remark goes into, is in more, let's say, contemporaneous or other household characteristics, maybe if the parents are still alive. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So I'm definitely looking into that. I know one thing is that there was some mechanism to support children which lost both parents in Burundi. Yeah, but of course this will be financial support or help them through school. So those mechanisms I can look further into. Yeah, thank you.
So, Philippe, we have an increasing number of questions, including one short question by Mohammad Sepavant. Do you have information on the quality of teachers? And since you wanted me to remind you of the time, it's 1:20.
No, that's a good point. So in a lot of the literature, one points at the quality of teaching and the class size and the availability of pedagogical material and all these things. And they definitely have an effect on school quality and also on final exam results. But I call that effect on contemporaneous things. So they are 1 year, 2 years, 3 years before the exam. Yeah. What I look is much further on. I'm going to investigate the health channel to which a potential effect channels. And so I have not included variables on school quality in terms of teacher absence or the education level of teachers. But from other literature, we know that they have an effect on school quality. But my paper is not on that channel. Yeah. Should I continue or yeah? All right. So now in this picture, I'm not going to look at the cases I matched, so my 900 children, but I'm going to look at all the children in the database of the ministry, so the registry of school test scores. Yeah. So of course, I don't have health data on these children. I only have health data on the children in the UNICEF survey. But what I can do, I have the birth year of these children, and I can see what time there was a conflict in their province of residence. And then I can see, well, I can compare the school results of the children who have never gone through a war shock. Their average result was about 89 scores on the test. I look at the children who were affected or exposed to civil war when they were in utero. So when their mother was pregnant of the child. And these children have test scores 10 years later, that is about 3 points less. Then I also look at the children who were shocked at birth. So in the year that they were born, were they then exposed to the civil war? And their result is even a bit lower. I'm going to also look, and that's the blue line that I'm tracing, the children who are affected in early infancy, the children are affected in late infancy and in primary. So the blue line traces their school test scores, even without any health information. It's just a descriptive analysis. So what is the test scores of students who are shocked at a specific point in their life? And then the red line, and just to add, very few students were shocked in primary school because the war was over. You had in a few municipalities, you will still have war going on, but I'm putting that there for reasons of completeness. The red line gives you the lifetime exposure of the child. If it was shocked, for example, in utero, then how many years, and that's on the right-hand side, a child exposed in utero would have a lifetime exposure of 4 years in the Burundi War. A child shocked at birth, a little bit more. A child in early infancy, also a little bit more. So this gives you the lifetime exposure of the shock. So just to have you an idea that it's not just a few months that these children have been exposed to civil war. It was really a long term. Most of the children are exposed between 3 and 4 years. Yeah. Okay, that's just an indication of how many children are we dealing with. Yeah? And then because we don't have that much time, let me draw some conclusions that, and of course it's very debatable if they are relevant for the COVID-19 crisis, but I just want to warn the macroeconomists in the public that we will experience some economic growth the next few years. That's compared to this year and 2020, that's for sure, because our economy will take off again. And it may be easy to say that, well, you know, the crisis seems over. The economy is, in macroeconomic figures, is doing very well again. But then I think we're forgetting the microeconomic effects of this pandemic. And I refer to civil war. Of course, the COVID-19 crisis has not destroyed buildings, has not derailed our infrastructure, and that's very fine. And I know from a lot of the recent opinion pieces that people want to boost to the macroeconomy, especially in infrastructure. So this is a time to renovate our country. And this makes sense because the interest rates are very low. So we can have a lot of debt and do a lot of productive investments. And that's very good. That will boost the macroeconomy. But I just want to point out that this doesn't mean that all these scars of the current pandemic will be over. At the micro level, just as when we're facing a civil war crisis, it's not because the economy is booming 2, 3 years, 5 years later that all these scars at the micro level will be over, especially not for those people who have not finished their education. Referring back to my engineering example of the beginning, the 30-year-old engineer or the 40-year-old academic today will have no problem contributing to the post-COVID economy. But this may be very difficult, very different for a person who is 16, 17, 18, who may be lost at the time of the pandemic, may have mental problems, may not finish schooling, may drop out from high school or drop out from university. And this is typically what I refer to as a temporary shocks, which have permanent consequences. And I think we will also have that for the COVID-19 epidemic, although they are maybe of a different nature and hopefully less severe than the consequences of civil war. I will leave it there, Mikael.
Thank you so much for bringing some gloom in this sunny day. I don't know if Mr. Casimir wants to ask the first question.
Yes,
Welcome.
thank you.
So Mr. Casimir is at the Royal Academy of Medicine and also a professor at ULB.
Yes, in pediatrics. It's very important, this kind of work for the future of these countries, but also for all the children of undeveloped countries in the world. And I would like to focus still on the role of the mothers, because there are a few studies, but also reports from UNICEF showing that in multivariate regression, the role of the education of the mothers is very, very important. And especially perhaps also the age of the mother at birth of the child. And also perhaps the duration of breastfeeding, because in this kind of countries, breastfeeding can occur during more than 15 months. And in war conflicts, the breastfeeding is very, very low. And this is also one important problem. And it's probably important in future studies to include this kind of data.
All right, just a brief reaction on the role of breastfeeding. I think you're very much on the point. So one reason why the I3h score is relatively good for very young children, so in a few months old or 1 year old, is especially because their nutrition is protected by the breastfeeding. And so they're not yet that exposed to the external environment. They are protected at least a few months by the breastfeeding. And that's one reason why the I3h score is relatively good for very young.
Thank you.
And I take your point on the age of the mothers and the age at birth. Yes.
Also important. I have a second question, if I can. There is about 230 million of children that were not registered in the population registers in undeveloped countries, and thus they have no right because they are not registered. And this is also very important, and I don't know in Burundi how much people are or not registered in the population registers.
Yeah, also a very good question. So, you know, the reason why economists just like me, we do this field work with household data and the World Bank collecting household data is especially we don't have a full account of administrative data in those countries of all the population. So that's why we do household surveys of 3,000, 5,000 households. So that's one thing. Now, there are some countries where at least one sector or the other, in this case, the education sector, sometimes also the military has, for example, administrative databases on all the soldiers or administrative databases on all the exam results. So that means for all the children who participate in the exam, at least you have that. That doesn't mean you have, let's say, information on all the 12 years old in the country. For sure that doesn't exist, but at least in some sectors, you may have interesting databases that you could use, even if they are not complete. I think that sometimes there's a census of the population, but then you only have 5 or 6 variables, like say the size of the house and the number of household members, but never any detailed information. And so either an administrative database of some sectors or a household survey where detailed information is on a very low number of households, let's say 5,000.
Thank you. A third comment is about the genocide in Burundi in the years 19, because there was at this time a very important undernutrition also, not only in children, but also in the parents. About half of the population and about 75% of the children at this moment very, very low protein, especially albumin level in the blood. And thus the problem is what will be the conflict in the world when population have so very low level of protein in the blood. It's not probably only a problem of a conflict between different ethnic groups, but also a very important problem of undernutrition of all the population.
Well, I think it's definitely one of the reasons why the Hutu rebel movement started to rebel, because especially in the north where they are concentrated, the undernutrition was very severe, and they saw that there was a lot of inequality in the country, so that the wealth and also the educational chances to advance in the school system were reserved for the southern population and also for the Tutsi population. And so for them, it was also one reason to rebel, namely the economic inequality in the country, which translated also in less opportunities in the education system.
Okay.
Yeah.
And finally, there is also a very important problem is the access to education according to the gender. There is so many women and especially young girls that are not able to access to education. It's a very important problem. Also very influenced by religious comportment, behaviors.
Yes, I think that is especially the case after primary school. Because we see a lot of the religion dominations allow or support women in primary school, but once it comes to secondary school or further education, you will see the gender gap kicking in.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have now a question by Anne Nguyen, and then I'll give you the floor, Yassine.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Perfectly.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to have a question from your idea, not based on any evidence. That I'm just wonder which I have 3 group of age of children, like from 5 to 10 or 10 to 15 and 15 to 18. So do you think that when the children can have some effect from the war, like the most age of
That's a good question. So there are a few instances in a very limited number of places where children are still affected when they're 8, 9, 10 years old. Yeah, that happens, but it's a very low number of children. Mostly, by far, the children in my data set are affected only in their childhood years. So, but you are right. I don't have much information on the timing between the exposure to war and their test results. Yeah, so that is 5 to 10, at least 5, 6 years. Many things can happen in those 5 years shift for sure, but I don't have any information on that.
Yeah, thank you. Just one more question. Yeah, so if I want to identify the effect of the war on the political determination, so do you think that which kind of parameter I should choose to evaluate those kind of children? I think.
I'm not sure I understand the question. You see the political barometer, or what was
yeah, some kind of political thinking or the political determination of the children. So which parameter I should choose to simulate the
so in another paper of mine, it's available on as an ECARES working paper. I have done some work on the school outcomes under a specific on one of the presidents of Burundi. So of course that affects the whole country at the same time, right? I cannot use an identification strategy whereby some students in some places are affected and others are not. If there's a new government or a new president, he or she has a nationwide effect. So in that case, I only can compare cohorts of students over time. I cannot compare geographically.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll have now Yassine Mazgoud, and then just after that will be Luigi Bojan.
Thank you. A very interesting presentation. I was wondering about how this relates to fatherhood, especially because in war and conflict, there is a male predominance a predominance of absence of males. I was wondering what the effect of fatherhood or what the opportunity would be for studying fatherhood with regard to a child's development. because I notice in general, it's a personal impression with the literature that when there's a focus on family and children's development, it's more in relationship to the mother. But I also notice that there is more of a trend with regard to fatherhood and the father. And for example, in obstetrics and gynecology, the role of the father in expecting the child and being there during the childbirth improves, has a positive impact on a child's development. So I was wondering, do you see any opportunities there, or do you think that that is sufficiently studied?
No, I mean, very good point. Very good point. I think, and I refer also to Paula's previous questions on the role of household characteristics and the effect of war on the presence of the father and the mother in the household. And also, of course, the level of education, maybe the occupation of the father. So you're completely right. Indeed, in developing countries, we mostly focus on the mother variables because we know that he or she is the first care person, and the first caretaker of the young child is the mother. Yeah, so I think that's a logical way to deal with that. Now, maybe the father is more important when the child is 5 or 10 years old. We don't know, but at least empirically, I should look into that. The role of the father. How important is it in Burundi for the young child remains a question, but definitely his or her presence and his role in the household may or may not have an effect, and it may or may not be affected by the civil war. So I think this is a very relevant question that I have not tackled yet.
Thank you. We also have a question by Luigi Bojan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for giving me the floor. Very interesting paper, very nice work. As I was saying also in the chat, in the Q&A, I'm a bit concerned about the exogeneity of the instruments and the fact that the deprivation that comes from being exposed to war might actually affect not just the health of the child, but also like the social network of the child and the family situation. So that's many other pointed out. But my comment was a bit more about the fact that potentially like this is whatever, like the fact, I mean, the estimates might be consistent, might be, my question here is about, are we actually sure that like this, I mean, here the estimates is providing probably a lower bound of the effect, because the setup is a low tech sort of war, and many other wars in the world are actually now high tech wars. So maybe we actually here having a lower bound of the issue. And my concern then is, are we sure that it is like the war or the violence and not just the deprivation that comes from that? So the exposure to deprivation rather than the exposure to war. I mean, yeah, so this is my comment.
And do you have an idea about how to not have a lower bound, but like a more middle bound?
Is this question for me or for Philip?
Yes, for you.
I have no idea.
Well, it is a lower bound for the reason already that I pointed out, that there are a lot of students with worse health who do not even make it to the exam, right? So who already dropped from school. Yeah. So the effect that I estimate is already a lower bound on the effect of health or undernutrition on one's schooling career, simply because some people don't even make it to that level. And this my previous work has shown out. I mean, this is a paper in the Journal of Biology and Economics, is of Human Biology and Economics, is especially pointing that out, that if you have a low height for HZ score between 0H and 5, you're more likely to die in subsequent years, and you will not even make it to the school. So this is already an indication that's a lower bound. Yeah, so that's one thing. Now,
you don't observe that. You don't observe dropouts one way or another.
Well, you can. You can. I don't do in this paper. I didn't analyze it, but you can. You can, if you, for example, you have a household survey. You can ask the school level of the students, and then you can say at age 11 they drop out from school, or age 10. You could do this kind of work, yeah. But I don't do it now, yeah. So. And then your second question about the role of war on the household situation, on the level of wealth. There is, of course, an element of that. Now, it also will go through one's health at some point. If you are poor, The war, it may increase your poverty, but that will also affect your health at some point. Yeah, so the health component may hide maybe also some poverty effect. Yeah, it's not maybe not only on nutrition, but maybe also the absence of, they can't bring you to school, for example, or they have no bicycle anymore, or all these kinds of things. But I may also think of including another wealth indicator to see if it's affected by war. The danger of one wealth indicator, it may be very, let's say, very time specific. It may be high in one year and low in the other year, whereas the health indicator is more an accumulation of the effects of health.
So I propose we have a brief question by Yassine first, and then Hilde, who has a question which is better for closing the conference, perhaps. Thank you.
It's a short one. With regard to the damage of war and displacement to infrastructure, I was wondering if if you know of any studies linking that to the long-term effect of, for example, parasitosis, parasitic infections on a child's development and performance at school.
So you mean forced displacement, right? Is that what you mean? Yeah. So that's indeed very important. We know that if populations are forcibly displaced, they are more prone to diseases. And so this is also the case in Burundi during the war. And that's also, luckily for my identification strategy, a lot of the displacement was intra-province. So the population or some households, hundreds of households, would go away 10 kilometers to escape a battle. They would stay there a few weeks and then they would return home. Yeah. So I don't have a specific displacement variable, but at least in terms of being affected by the war, they stayed mostly in the same province. Yeah. Does that mean that during displacement their health was worstly affected? That could be the case. Yeah. But for me, this is then the war exposure variable. Yeah. And maybe underlying a war exposure variable, maybe an element of forced displacements where I don't control for that. But of course, from other work, we know that forcibly displaced populations are more prone to health problems, are more prone to violence problems, for sure. And this is also the case in Burundi, but I do not control for that.
Thank you. Hilde?
Yes, thank you, Philip. It was a very interesting presentation. So you test, or the test has been done in children aged around 15, which is fairly late, I think. I was wondering what the recommendations are from your work, showing definitely the effects of war on them. Could it be that they should do or should be tested much earlier onwards, so a closer follow-up and closer feedback and guidance in education can be done? What were your recommendations?
Yeah, so, it's very difficult to intervene during a war situation. Yeah, we already now see how difficult it is to do something around mental health in our COVID crisis in Belgium, where we are a rich country. So one thing we could do is say, let the war takes a few years. The children who miss out, let's say they are 10, 11, 12 years old, who missed out some years of education, we put them together in a separate classroom. Yeah, rather than putting them with the 6-year-old or the 7-year-old who's just started education, because these children who are 10, 12 years old, they will feel very bad about it. But let's put them together and let's pretend that they are starting their education again. Doing something special for them to make sure that they don't drop out from school all the way, and help them to restart their education without stigmatizing them that they are now the older students who cannot follow in the normal system anymore. So I think also that accounts for the COVID crisis. We have to do special efforts for those students who miss out education without stigmatizing them.
Thank you.
So I had missed a question by Cici Zhang.
Hi, I have a question because here you use the text score as a proxy for cognitive development, but actually cognitive development contains a lot of aspects. You have numbers, space, language skills, etc. Since you have text score, you use the text score as a whole, but I'm thinking, would it be possible in your data set, maybe you have more disaggregated each of the subjects, and then maybe you could see more which aspect actually could be more affected of the war. For instance, maybe math skill or language skill, etc.
Yes, that's a good question. I didn't have time to go into that, but indeed I can do the same type of analysis for the different disciplines. And I also did that. I do not recount the magnitude of the effect, but for French and for mathematics, those were driving the results. They also weigh the most in the final score. But at least when I develop the paper further, I will have to present results per discipline, because that's indeed is relevant. It may be that the effects on reading are higher than for maths or vice versa. I don't recall the magnitude of the effect, but they were there for reading as well as for mathematics.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much to all. I don't know if there is any additional question. I don't see any additional hand raised and no additional question in the Q&A. So Philippe, thank you so much. It was an amazing presentation. As you saw, it attracted lots and lots of comments and curiosity. I see many thanks coming in the chat. So many thanks to all the participants and for making the presentation even livelier. And thank you, Philippe, for sharing your research with us. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot for having me, and thanks for all the comments and questions. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.